Ready?
Yes, sir.
It's like, wait a second. All right. So welcome everyone. My name is Kanik Aguirre. I am your chair for this NVTC WMATA committee meeting tonight, October 21st. And it looks like we're starting at 6:05 p.m. 60. I'm going to compromise between the TV and my cell phone to say 6:06. But we are back to normal committee meetings with a few modifications. We are continuing with our safety protocols due to the surge of the Delta variant. With our updated NVTC electronic participation policy, it is now easier for commissioners to participate virtually for specific reasons, as long as we have an in-person forum, which it appears that we do have. We still ask that commissioners speak up so those participating electronically can hear clearly what is being said. And staff, just to confirm, we have forum. All right. So this meeting is being live streamed to allow our listening audience, including jurisdictional staff, to be able to watch through YouTube Live. We will go ahead and get started. Before we get to our formal agenda, though, I would like to acknowledge the Blue Line derailment last week, as well as the subsequent service changes that have taken place this week. As this body has oversight over Omada, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't bring this up. It's been a topic of intense discussion. And before we move to the first agenda item, I'd like to ask Kate to give a few remarks.
Sure, thank you, Chair Aguirre. Indeed, I've been in close contact with our Virginia WMATA board members who've asked me to relay the following message. The WMATA board has regularly met this week and is closely monitoring the investigation of the Blue Line derailment. We are respecting the NTSB investigation process and understand our riders, stakeholders, and the public want answers that will come from a full and thorough examination of the incident. The board advocates sharing as much information as possible, but is bound by the NTSB rules on this, as the NTSB is the lead during this investigation. As a result of the NTSB's Blue Line derailment investigation, the WMATA Board of Directors announced yesterday, October 20th, that it is taking immediate action to retain outside consultants to serve as safety advisors to the board. These independent advisors will provide the board with expert opinions, analysis, and recommendations on a full range of issues concerning the safety, operations, and organizational accountability of Metro. Areas of focus will include, but are not limited to, safety reporting, communications, inspections, roles and responsibilities, regulatory requirements, hazard identification, employee training, safety performance indicators, targeters, and procurement. This action is consistent with the board's safety oversight role to ensure WMATA develops, implements, and constantly improves processes to ensure the highest levels of safety for our customers and employees. There's also an FAQ page on WMATA's website and additional information on the derailment and subsequent investigation. Staff will continue to provide links to the committee following this evening's meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Matthijs. Just real fast, any commissioners, quick comments or thoughts that you want to get out? Go ahead. All right.
Sure.
Go ahead, Mr.
Two things. I had asked for Metro board members to be here, and they responded exactly as they did there. The NTSB didn't, as long as that investigation is going on, they consulted with staff and weren't able to be here. So I think we all clearly have an interest and concern. I also hope that when we come to the WMATA study, that we'll specifically reference this particular study and want full updates. And I remain concerned about enterprise risk management within Metro, and I would like more information on that. Why do these things keep happening, and what's the plan? I appreciate that moving forward, some positive things have been presented, but I do think this committee needs to stay on this issue, and I know, I suspect that we intend to do that. I just think we need to make it clear in writing when it comes to the Metro report. Anyway, thank you.
Mm-hmm. No, just to echo some of the sentiment of Mr. Snyder, I think, for all of us, safety is paramount no matter what. So we will most definitely be following up. Okay, now to our formal agenda. I'd like to turn to the first item, which is the review of the September 16th, 2021 NVTC WMATA committee meeting summary. Any changes, amendments, thoughts? All right, we'll get that one out of the way quickly. Moving on to agenda item number 2. This will be our briefing from Omada on the blue, orange, and silver capacity and reliability study. In September, the Omada board received a briefing on the blue, orange, silver capacity and reliability study. Omada is currently conducting elected official outreach, and I am pleased to have the study team here to present to the committee as part of that outreach process. So I'd like to welcome our guests from Omada today and turn it over to you for a presentation.
Thank you, Chair. Good day. Thank you, Commissioners. My name is Sean Cunnin. I'm the Planning Director at Omada. With me is my colleague,
Mark Phillips,
and your title.
Planning Program Manager.
Thank you, Sean. So we're here to provide a progress update on the blue, orange, silver capacity and reliability study. And at this point in time, these briefings are timely because we are about to commence our 3rd round of engagement with public stakeholders and elected officials. And we certainly want to ensure that stewards of the public, including the Commission, are well aware of the progress in the study before we were out in the public interacting with your constituents. As a recap, this study began actually in 2019, before the pandemic, to address multiple long-standing issues within this corridor, including reliability, crowding, equity, and other service issues. Trains in this corridor have been crowded during peak hours for more than a decade. Largely because of the capacity constraint of putting 3 colored lines through one portal. We call that interlining, and then merging to go underneath the Roslyn Tunnel. So if we take a look at when we were running this service, the study began in 2019, Orange Line trains were routinely exceeding our loading standards of 100 persons per car, not just in 2019, but throughout the entire decade. Some of those peak trains were carrying more than 120 persons per car. So over the past 5 years, that corridor has been averaging about 105 persons per car. So again, over our loading standards. And then when we modified Blue Line service in 2014 in order to accommodate the Silver Line, on the Blue Line, its passengers per car leaped to somewhere between 115 and 130 persons per car. So interlining also caused a lot of problems with reliability and on-time performance. What it means is that when there's a problem on one line, it has a cascading impact to the other lines. So between 2015 and 2017, our on-time performance in the blue, orange, and silver corridor regularly fell 15 to 25% below the system-wide average. So high crowding, low performance. It's important to note that these crowding issues and reliability issues existed before the pandemic, and while the pandemic's long-term impacts on travel demand just aren't clear yet, all of the reliable information we have suggests that the long-term growth and development in this corridor will bring that problem back and actually increase both the severity and magnitude of the overcrowding and reliability problems. Put bluntly, we know there's a problem at the Roslyn bottleneck. We can either live with it for the next 50+ years or to try and get in front of the problem by identifying and developing a project now so that it can be in place and agreed upon before the crowding crisis hits again. So this study's purpose is to identify and settle upon a preferred alternative, preferred solution for this interlining problem. But like all major transit projects, delivering a solution is not an overnight activity. 10, 20, 30 years is not an unreasonable amount of time to think about in terms of a gestation period for a project like this. So this study is just the first step in a long process. We are following federal guidelines to enable this project should it continue to move forward, should a decision be made to seek federal funding to allow the project to compete for federal funding. So that includes all the work we're doing, the alternatives analysis, and it also includes extensive public and stakeholder engagement. Before I turn it over to Mark, I just want to make sure that I'm very clear that at this point in time, we are not recommending a particular solution today. That we as Omada are taking this project on behalf of the region. These lines cross boundaries. Omada is a regional entity. And I want to be clear that nothing in this presentation should be construed as a recommendation. So with that, I will now turn this over to Mark Phillips, who will give you more details on the project background and will answer questions.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. Talking through a mask during a presentation is a relatively new phenomenon for me, even though this has been going on for a year and a half. So please let me know if you can't hear me, if I'm not being loud enough. The slides advanced a little bit during Shyam's introduction, but I think this is actually a good place to start because it picks up with some of the points that Shyam was making. A lot of the materials that you've seen in front of you have information in there about the future, but it's very important to realize that the entire impetus behind this study is an existing condition that has been around for over a decade, and that is the crowding through the Rosslyn Tunnel from the interlining of those 3 lines running through one tunnel set of tracks between the Potomac and the Anacostia. So we've already have a situation where the service in that corridor is violating our service standards, and we know, because of all available data that we have today and all models, that the growth and development trajectory along the corridor is likely to increase ridership, magnitude, the increase of magnitude or severity of crowding, as well as the geographic extent. So it will expand to more stations and more line segments. Next slide. However, as Shyam mentioned, because of that interlining, we do not have the capacity to run enough trains to meet that demand. We can operate a maximum of 26 trains per hour through any set of tracks per direction. And that means that when we have this, the 8-minute schedule during the peak hour that we were running before the pandemic, we can divide that 26 trains an hour equally between the 3 lines. But when we try to operate 6-minute headways, which is what we were doing in 2016, 2017 before the Safe Track program, we had to reduce one of the lines, in this case, the blue line, by about half in order to accommodate the silver line. And as Shyam mentioned, that meant the ridership or the crowding on the blue line shot up dramatically. So the takeaway here is that because of that 26 train per hour constraint, we cannot operate enough trains to meet the current demand, to get our current crowding below our service standards, and yet and we also can't support the future demand and the crowding that's projected.
It's based on, sorry,
Yes.
it's based on numbers 16, 17, 18, right?
And 2019
Got
as
it.
well.
Pre-pandemic.
Yes, pre-pandemic. The 8-car train program does help the crowding issue, but it will not solve it. Next slide. As Shyam mentioned, there's also reliability concerns that come with having all 3 of these lines operate on one tunnel. That is, if there's a condition on one, it cascades to the other 2. And because the blue line is also interlined with the yellow line, if it's a severe enough disruption, it can impact yellow and green line service. We also are able, thanks to the dedicated capital funding passed by the jurisdictions, we've been able to ramp up our state of good repair program and take care of a lot of our backlog. But that means that work zones are going to be part of our service planning for a long time to come. And we need to explore opportunities to better navigate around those work zones and to reduce the size and impacts of single tracking on our customers. Next slide. Finally, we'd also like any solution or any preferred alternative to advance metros and the region's goals for sustainability and equity. This includes improving our cost profile, our cost fare box recovery ratio, supporting transit-oriented development, and making the region a more equitable place to live by expanding access to economic opportunities and useful places, particularly for equity areas and low-income areas. Next slide. So those are the challenges and issues that any solution proposed by this study should tackle. We worked with our stakeholder committees and the public to come up to turn those challenges, those problem statements, into 4 goals. Goal number 1 is to provide sufficient capacity to meet that demand. Goal 2 is to improve reliability and on-time performance. Goal 3 is improving operational flexibility and cost efficiency. And goal 4 is to support sustainable development and expand access to opportunity. Those 4 goal statements, as I mentioned, were workshopped with our stakeholders. They guided the development or the selection of initial alternatives, as well as defining the performance measures for assessing the performance and costs and benefits of the 6 current alternatives that we will present today. Next slide. Any project that is likely to be able to address those challenges and meet those 4 goals is likely to be a relatively large investment. It could take 10 to 20 years or more to deliver. Because we know that Metro and the region would probably want to pursue federal funding support for such a project, we designed the current study in alignment with federal requirements for project design and project development. And this diagram that you can see on the bottom half of the slide places this study in the wider context of federal requirements for a federal grant. So what this is showing you is that this 2.5 year, maybe 3 year study is only the first step in a long process. Once we identify the LPA, we still have to take it through a federal process that could take 5 to 10 years just to get through development and design. And the really important takeaway here is that there is no commitment to the region or metro to build or deliver a project until there's a funding agreement between the region and the federal government. So over the next 5 to 10 years, we will be keeping an eye on ridership, on demand, and on crowding. If it seems over time that we will no longer have some of these challenges that we've described today, we are able to stop work before that funding commitment. But the important thing is, because this is such a long project delivery timeline, and we believe that this crowding and these issues will reoccur, we need to keep moving forward. We need to keep working until we have that clear signal so that we can make sure this project is in place and delivered before crowding becomes a crisis. It's crisis levels. Next slide. As I mentioned, we are aligning this with federal requirements. In this case, for the study itself, it's federal requirements under the National Environmental Policy Act for studies called alternatives analysis. So this diagram that you can see on the slide in front of you just walks you through the major stages of the study, identifying the goals, identifying an initial range of options to meet those goals, and then working with the public and stakeholders to narrow that down to a set of alternatives, run a cost benefit analysis, and finally support Metro's board of directors in identifying a solution or locally preferred alternative. The stars you see there are the major times for public engagement. So we did that to identify the goals and spread the word. We did it when we had an initial set of options to start narrowing that down to the current set of alternatives. And as Sean mentioned, we're going to be going out back for a third round of public engagement to get the information and data to support the board of directors in selecting the LPA. Next slide. A little bit more detail on stakeholder and public engagement to date. We do have 4 formal, stakeholder committees. We have 2 internal, one of tech and one of policy leaders and management. And we have 2 external stakeholder committees, including staff from NVTC. We have a policy level there and a technical staff level stakeholder. And each one of these committees has met 6 times to date. We also held 4 public meetings, had an online survey, 2 workshops of community-based and business organizations along the corridor, as well as 2 meetings or workshops of elected officials today. All that information, all that feedback, we got over 2,000 survey responses, gave us an initial universe or set of options of 275 ideas, which we then were able, with the 4 goals and additional analysis, to narrow down to 16 project concepts, and then further narrow down to the 6 alternatives that I'll be showing you today. Next slide. As Sean mentioned at the beginning, the intent of this study, of this presentation, this meeting, is actually to show you the 6 alternatives are currently being considered as part of the selection of the LPA. But none of them, nothing you see today should be taken as a recommended solution or recommended LPA. That final LPA might be one of these 6, or it might be a recombination of components from different alternatives. We won't know that until we go through that 3rd round of public engagement and do a little bit more analysis. Next slide. This slide shows you kind of the relation between the different types or levels of the alternatives. So our first alternative of the 6 is the no build scenario, which those of you familiar with alternatives analyses know is always included. And that is basically asking the question, can you meet your goals or solve your problems solely with the projects that the region has already committed to build? So this includes all the projects in the regional long-range plan, the constrained portion of it, as well as WMATA's capital investment program. That includes Silver Line Phase 2, the Potomac Yard Station, and jurisdictional projects like the Purple Line. Stepping up in terms of scale, impacts, costs, and benefits, we have a lower capital cost alternative. And this was in response to strong stakeholder feedback asking us to look at something that would cost less than a Metrorail alignment and yet still meet those 4 goals. And that lower capital cost alternative is based mostly on a large network of enhanced bus services, including 6 bus rapid transit routes, looking at dynamic scheduling on the rail lines, and expanding the capacity of our core stations. And then finally, scaling up again in costs, benefits, and impacts, we have 4 potential realignments of the Metrorail system. Next slide. This map just shows you the existing scenario, the no build scenario, the existing system. You can kind of see the purple line on there and a fainter line. The only detail here I want to point out is that because we are forecasting ridership and crowding out to 2040, we are assuming in all cases that we're back to a 6-minute service schedule. Next slide. The lower capital cost alternative, as I mentioned, is really heavily focused on bus service, trying to make sure that we can solve those crowding issues on the Blue Orange to Silver rail lines by providing a bus service that could be attractive enough as an alternative that people would shift from the rail lines to bus and thus reduce our crowding through the tunnel. That's 6 BRT lines, 3 in Virginia on Columbia Pike, Wilson, Clarendon, and US 29.
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
Yeah, Columbia Pike, US 29, and Wilson Boulevard are the 3 Virginia BRT routes that go into downtown DC. We're also looking, because you might remember that some of our goals and the problems that we were talking about was our cost profile and our cost of doing business and trying to better match our service to demand. So the lower capital cost alternative does include rail turnback infrastructure at West Falls Church for the Silver Line and at the D&G Junction for any of the 3 lines. Next slide. The first of the potential Metrorail realignments takes the existing blue line and runs it to a second Roslyn station, which would have a direct pedestrian tunnel connection to the current Roslyn station. From there, we travel in a new tunnel up to Georgetown around M Street and down M Street through downtown DC to Union Station. From Union Station, would turn northeast, serving the Ivy City area in DC, up to the Port Towns area in DC and Prince George's County, onto Greenbelt and College Park. And I just want to note, because you've heard Shyam and I talk about interlining and the impacts on the system, that in each of these cases where the new line might come near the existing system, we are assuming that it will be separate tracks and separate stations to avoid re-interlining. Next slide. The second Metrorail alternative is a new blue line to National Harbor. This would have the same alignment through downtown DC to Union Station, but from Union Station, it would turn south and serve fast-growing areas like Buzzard Point, St. Elizabeth's, Navy Yard, and National Harbor before turning over to Alexandria, crossing the Wilson Bridge. Next slide. The third alternative actually is a Silver Line realignment that builds a completely new tunnel for the Silver Line at West Falls Church to a Roslyn 2 station. This alternative would separate the Silver Line entirely from both the orange and the blue lines. And with that completely separate tunnel, which would keep the existing connection to the Orange Line tunnel or the Roslyn tunnel, we could operate either all express Silver Line service in Virginia or a mix of express and local. But this has the largest increase in total train carrying capacity across the river of the alternatives. Once it hits a Roslyn 2 station, it crosses the Potomac to Georgetown, has its same alignment on M Street to Union Station, and then that echoes the same alignment that you saw with the blue line going up to Greenbelt and College Park. Next slide. The final rail alternative creates a new Roslyn 2 station, again, separates the Silver at Courthouse or outside of Courthouse, runs along Union Station, runs along M Street from Georgetown to Union Station. But this time it would go up Ivy City and serve Port Towns before heading east along the Annapolis Road corridor to the new Carrollton station. Next slide. As I mentioned, we have actually finished a cost benefit analysis and performance assessment of these 6 alternatives. We have 14 performance measures that are all directly related to the 4 goal statements I reviewed earlier. And this was a quantitative assessment of the impacts and benefits for each of those performance measures. When you consider only the performance measures and the benefits of each alternative compared to the no build scenario or the known future, that the new blue line to National Harbor performed the best in terms of net benefits. The lower capital cost alternative, which again tries to deal with the crowding issues with bus service, was the least effective in terms of benefits. The new Silver Line Express or the new Silver Line Tunnel in Northern Virginia was the second most beneficial. When you factor cost into it, this is both the capital cost to build and the annual operating and maintenance costs. that flips the script a little bit. So the lower capital cost option becomes the most cost effective. The new blue line to National Harbor becomes the second most cost effective. And unfortunately, the Silver Line Express or the new tunnel in Virginia, because it is the most expensive of the options, becomes the least cost effective. The table below that's in front of you shows some metrics. In addition to this cost benefit analysis, you can see some estimates for the net new weekday ridership and revenue that would come from the alternatives. So the new blue line would bring us about 180,000 new weekday riders and 154 million in fare revenue. It would also be the second most costly at around $20 to $25 billion to build and 175 to 200, sorry, it's far away, million in annual operating costs. The lower capital alternative is much cheaper. And we do believe that it could hit the 4 goals and address the challenges that we described earlier. But I do need to note, because it focuses so much on bus service, that it would require the jurisdictions to invest heavily in bus prioritization treatments and bus rapid transit service on their corridors and on their streets. Bless you. And it would also, it's based on the assumption that we could get somewhere from 2,500 to 3,000 peak weekday riders to transfer willingly from the rail to the bus system. So these are some of the assumptions and targets, and I just need to point out that that needs to be a consideration when looking at these alternatives. Next slide. So that's where we are today. We have this cost benefit analysis information and performance assessment. As I mentioned, in sometime this fall or winter, we're going to be going out to the public and starting public engagement. We'll be asking the public how they feel about these alternatives, what they think, maybe asking them what they think makes the most sense in Virginia, what makes the most sense in Maryland, and trying to look at that recombination I mentioned of Frankensteining some of these alternatives. And we are looking to support the board selection of that locally preferred alternative in early 2022, hopefully. That is the end of the presentation, and Sham and I will take your questions, which I'm sure you have.
Thank you very much. Yeah. At this point, we're going to open it up for commissioner questions. And Ms. Mayor.
Try to speak loudly because I'm masked. I know that you're in the middle of this multi-year timeline. So forgive me if I'm going to go back in time and make a statement. I've made this statement maybe 5 years ago, and I've withheld making it again because I don't think it moves the needle forward any. But from the very, very beginning, and I grew up with this metro system around me, when it first was rolled out, a number of us made comments that the fundamental conceptual problem with this system is you only have one track in each direction. And it's mind-boggling that this could be designed conceptually this way, when in fact you had a system in New York that had been in existence for at least half a century with a different concept. And even at the time, even in 1980, people were saying, this is a ticking time bomb. This system is going to collapse because of this conceptual flaw. And here we are now, 40 years later, and this is what we're facing. Now, your presentation, you had 2,000 online survey responses. You had 275 concepts. I did make the suggestion 5 years ago that Metro ought to look for a demonstration project where one or more of the existing lines that might be extended could have a 4-track configuration as a demonstration project. Now, it would only be 4 tracks to a certain point, and then it would end. But I think your concept for the Silver Line at Falls Church going into Roslyn is kind of a variation on that motif. But it certainly doesn't really get to the core problem, the fundamental core problem of this system. When you look at your solutions chart, goals 1 and 3, a 4-track solution would directly align with goals 1 and 3 and would enable you to reach goal number 2 a little more effectively. And the only reason I'm bringing this up now and saying this is because when you started talking in terms of 20 to 30 years, maybe one of those 275 suggestions was a 4-track scenario. If you're just talking fiscally unrestrained, I still think that whether it's blue line to Greenbelt or the blue line to National Harbor or even the silver line to New Carrollton, looking at the concept of a 4-track solution where you might only stop every 3 or 4 stops and have an express lane, not unlike the Broadway local versus the express on the Upper West Side. I think that would go a long way to meeting your goals. I mean, if you're just talking fiscally unrestrained, I harbor no illusions about the fact that what I'm saying is probably not going to go anywhere. But since we're having this conversation and we're thinking audaciously, I'm just putting it out there. And I do believe, though, that the silver line is conceptually sort of dancing around the edges of what I'm talking about in terms of having parallel tracks. But if you're gonna do that, go to all the effort to create a separate tunnel. What the hell? Make it 4 tracks. Now, I get it. We've talked about this extensively about the choke point at Roslyn. And even if you put the tunnel in, you're going to have extensive needs to reconfigure the system on both sides of the river. And now you're talking 15 billion. I mean, the tunnel itself might be, 3, but all the ancillary changes over the next 15 years would require a considerable amount of money. But if not at that location, what location? And if not now, when? And this is not about, I think nobody in this room might even be alive by the time that the true benefits of that kind of investment are realized. But I think that's really what we're faced with. And it's unfortunate that in 1970 or 1975 that somebody didn't have the long-term perspective to say this is what we're going to do now, so that in 70 years we won't have to try and fix this. That didn't happen, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't at least do a demonstration project for one part of the system. And once it's up and it's successful, it could have a cascading effect in terms of our capital planning.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I agree wholeheartedly with some of your comments. One, having the example from New York, but 2, especially in Northern Virginia, and I'm going to assume in Maryland. This is years ago, but we had a completely different landscape, right? There wouldn't have been any issue to put 4 lanes. Personally, I mean, we would have had all the space in the world to do it, so it's unfortunate. But of course, we're not here to just lament. We're here to also try and find some solutions. And I think you bring a good point, even if it is just a pilot or something to show, possibly putting that into the queue. But Mr. DeFranti.
I appreciate that long-term perspective. I have to just go back to Mr. Snyder's comment. I do think that you have a tough job describing the long-term planning at this particular moment, it feels. So I do think, I don't know what the right mechanism, but I do think that, we can certainly review it, but noting the challenges, and I would at least support moving for something in writing and that just sort of conveys the current moment. That's not you guys, but I do think that that's appropriate. I guess a couple of comments that try to bridge the gap between the great, really helpful long-term thinking here and where we are now. Is it within your team's authority to recalibrate the analysis of when we would need this? I know that you're talking 40 years, but it just seems hard to argue that at least 2 years we haven't shifted 2 years down the road, or 3 or 4. And so I just don't know if that's your department thing or an other department, because I don't quite know the full scope of planning at Metro's authority, if that makes sense. So I don't know if one of you can talk to that, is because I think one question has to be, what's the timing of the study? And then there's what's the analysis of when we get back to the 6-minute 12, the problems that we've all lived through. And I think I'm sort of asking the second question. One is have you guys been charged with yet, or is there another team that would be charged with adjusting a little bit the timing while continuing the work that you're doing?
There's a two-part question there. Thank you for the question. And Chair Geary and Commissioners, this is a lovely discussion. I want to make sure that we address each piece in kind. I'll address the who does what piece, and then I'm going to ask Mark to ask how that gets woven in. So I run an office called the Planning Office, but what we actually do is not only the long-range planning for regional mobility, but we also do ridership forecasting. We also do impact analyses of service and fare decisions. We do fare strategy for the company. We manage transit equity. And we put together the fiscal and economic impact analyses. We try and sort of drive a business data and decision analytics unit for the company. So to that, and yes, it would fall under purview of my shop to revisit the ridership assumptions, the forecast assumptions that we are inheriting from our local government partners, and to sharpen our pencils, if you will, post this, COVID-induced climate, so that we can have a sharper understanding of what to anticipate in 2023, 2024. We are doing that on an almost daily basis now. Now, I've given you sort of 50% of what my office does, but how that specifically fits into this study, I think is germane to your specific question.
Sure. If you can turn to what I believe is slide 9, that shows our study within the context of the larger federal process. The timeline.
Yep.
Yeah. So you'll notice on there that the two first phases after this Blue Orange and Silver study are NEPA and project development and the engineering phase. The most likely time, we'll be keeping an eye on ridership throughout this entire process up until the funding agreement. But the most likely time to kind of recalibrate our ridership models and our assumptions in post-COVID, post-pandemic reality is during that project development phase. So towards the end of that next NEPA and project development, so the next project phase.
Got it.
To make it super blunt, we can't live with the projections that we inherited in 2019, and we won't.
Yeah. So, sorry.
But we also need to, we also need to wait until there's good longitudinal data that's reliable. And we don't have that yet.
Yeah, so I feel like the next slide after that, slide 10 on the study process. I think we discussed this a little bit at our last full commission meeting, but it feels you don't want to stop public engagement on these areas, but at the same time, I just don't see how it's the next few months or 6 months. I don't see how. I would think that the study process has to there's a good argument in my mind for it shifting to be a little further down the road, because I mean, today, the word reliability just means a totally different thing than it does in this analysis. So is that a fair guess? We're all in public processes that we don't want to take forever. But, working with engaging our public, it just seems like we have had to shift some of the initiatives in Arlington that we're doing to a later date. And I wondered if you've gotten there yet, or if that is an ongoing discussion of the study processes, sliding out a little bit in terms of time.
The challenge and opportunity with a study of this magnitude or the responsibility of being planning director at a place like Metro is that it is never a good time to do long-range planning.
Yeah.
And it's always the right time to do long-range planning.
Yeah.
When we looked at these problems in Northern Virginia in 2011, in 2012, 2013, there were voices that said you can't advance this type of thinking right now because the only thing we can focus on is the opening of this. When we continue to see these problems after the opening of the Silver Line, there were voices that said you cannot advance thinking about a project like this because we have Safe Track. There have been other incidents and other tragedies on the railroad that prevented this from being something that seemed convenient to talk about. And so, Commissioner, I think that what we're doing is the hard work of responsibly stewarding some solutioning, even though managing the public dialogue is going to be harder than we wish it was.
It's very, very thoughtful. So that helps, Mr. Chair. I mean, I would just, I just hope that, I think these numbers and this analysis is really helpful. On the one slide that you have about the 4 different alternatives, I think, Mark, you mentioned like a cost per additional rider. And I don't know that maybe I'm not reading it right, but I don't know that I quite see that metric in the slide.
No, it's the total annual O&M cost. So to operate each alternative on an annual basis, it's not down to cost per rider yet.
Yeah. So maybe I just misheard you. There's a part of your analysis that there are different ways to slice, to analyze the 5 alternatives. And you by now know that elected officials, like every human being, sometimes learn verbally and they sometimes learn visually. And at some point, as you go into the next phases, it might be helpful to see what you said. If you don't mind. Just
Commissioners, I apologize. So the Commissioner's question, I believe that the details on the benefit cost analysis are documents that will be on the website, and we would be more than pleased to help make visually apparent to you what Mark said so that there's no confusion
Sure.
or misstatement. We'd love to do that.
I think it was confusing, but I was probably multitasking.
No.
It's clear.
We would be delighted to make sure that to the Commissioner Meyer, to your question earlier, one thing I heard you say was this will probably go nowhere. And I think to the commission, as well as to the general public that might be tuning in right now or will be joining us in public, the purpose of this is for all of your suggestions to in fact go somewhere. So I want to make sure that you're hearing from us that your notions today, recommendations and thoughts do actually go into this, and we'll try to prosecute them and resolve them to the best of our abilities. So please keep the ideas coming. We want to run with them.
And I apologize if if that was misconstrued, that I was casting it toward you or the Metro organization. I was really speaking more in terms of a more regional political will to do something of that magnitude. Although I would like to be proven wrong, and I do appreciate you listening to this. It's not something that you hadn't heard already. It's simply probably beyond the scope of where this particular study is, trying to realistically and something that's actually doable. But I do believe that I find it frustrating that there's no consideration anytime in the near future about the extension of existing lines such as the Orange Line, for example, to Centerville or beyond. Yet there was right-of-way set aside for the I-66 toll lane project to accommodate a surface Orange Line going out that far. But the width of it is only going to permit 2 tracks. I raised that issue 4 years ago with VDOT when they were coming up with the concepts for the highway. But it's kind of was a voice in the wilderness. So I'm just trying to explain where I'm coming from on this. And I was a graduate student in Washington, DC in the 1970s. And I watched the first sections of Metro being constructed in downtown DC and studied the designs and everything else. And I mean, I had that observation when I was 23 years old. So it's, the chickens are coming home to roost here, you know, and we're, you know, did anyone anticipate the population growth and the economic growth of this region to be what it is today? I think some people did. But this is a lesson again on political realities and trying to do the art of the possible. And we all want to move these things forward. And we try to find, well, what is politically and economically, from an environmental perspective, what is politically, what's possible? And I was simply trying to widen the aperture of the view on that and see if we couldn't think, not lose sight of this 4-track concept for either extensions of existing lines or perhaps even the creation of a whole new line sometime in the next 50 years, going from Roslyn through South Arlington to Franconia or someplace like that. Just for example, I'm Virginia centric because I'm here in Virginia, but still. Or if in fact at some point in the next 50 years, we decided to do something circular to connect the spokes, that any configuration like that ought to have a 4-track option. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Could we turn to the no-build scenario slide? Bring that back up, 'cause I want to make sure I understand it. So explain to me this slide again, particularly the list of peak service.
It's slide 14.
It's, if you can rewind it, because I think this is actually a pretty important slide. It's the no-build scenario.
There we go. Back the other way.
For cost
One more
capital,
back.
one more.
There we go.
Okay. So explain to me the little chart over on the left-hand side. It says peak service plan 2040. What does that assume in terms of any of these options that we're building?
So because it is the no build scenario, it doesn't factor in any of the Metrorail alternatives, the other alternatives that we're looking at. It's just the existing Metrorail system with Silver Line Phase 2 and Potomac Yard. So because our CIP and the regional long range plan, the fiscally constrained long range plan doesn't have any capacity building projects for WMATA in terms of service, new trains per hour. That 6-minute service pattern, even in 2040, would be constrained by that same Roslyn tunnel capacity constraint that we had on an earlier slide, that 26 trains per hour. So you might remember that I mentioned when we were on that slide that the last time we ran 6 minutes on the orange and silver, we had to reduce the blue line to 5 trains an hour or every 12 minutes. So this 2040 service pattern reflects that reality.
So if we don't do any of this, you're projecting 6-minute headways on the orange and silver line, 3 minutes on the red line. This is making a pretty good case for not doing what you're proposing to do. Because frankly, as a regular rider of Metro, when I was still going into the office on a daily basis, if I had reliable 6-minute service, I think that's pretty good. So, I think this chart needs some explanation. If in fact this is true, then one arrives at a different potential analysis. That's number one. Number two, this sort of spoke approach, I'm not sure reflects the region's need anymore. I'm not sure we're ever going to go back to the commuter loads in and out of the suburbs into DC. And the real need is to move people around Northern Virginia. I'm speaking purely from a Northern Virginia standpoint. So I'm particularly interested in the low-cost alternatives. That is, what would have to be built, where, and what would its cost be, and how many riders. In other words, I want a true comparison between the low-cost alternative for Northern Virginia, because right now that's what I represent. If you ask me if I'm on TPV, it's, you know, whatever. But right now we're NVTC, so I'm principally focused on Northern Virginia. And my fear is that even if you added all this capacity, number one, without adding it, you've got 6-minute headways, which I would love the fact that there'd be reliable 6-minute headways. And furthermore, you may not be serving the future needs of Northern Virginia very effectively, because it's going to cost a lot of money to do this, and we're obviously going to have to pay our fair share. So I'm particularly interested in the data in the future utilization. Where are people going? Why are they going there? And what's the best way to serve them? And based upon changes that we've seen in the past year and that seem to continue, you're not going to get the kind of travel patterns that the system was designed for and served for several decades. So that would be point number one. I really feel that there needs to be some significant look at the data, both in terms of demand, the best way to meet that demand, and so in terms of funding, I would like some scenarios to deal with pretty early. For example, if we did options 1, 2, 3, and 4 for low-cost option, what would you be expecting from the City of Falls Church or any other jurisdiction? One can envision all kinds of wonderful things in the future, but without the costs, you can make a serious mistake about what the public will accept. And then you go down the line, you've spent a lot of money on planning and oops, public isn't willing to support it. So the earlier you can get the dollar signs and actually allocate it to jurisdiction, worst case, middle case, optimistic case, you know, whatever, it seems to me would be really helpful. You know, there are a lot of different ways, like Paris has 2 systems. It's got the Metrorail system with a lot of stops, and it has the RER, which is kind of an express thing, sometimes running parallel, sometimes not. So I think that was an idea proposed. But my concern is that the basic outline of the Metro system no longer reflects the demand, which has changed a lot. The question is, we're all asking, how long? But I rather suspect it may be permanent. So if so, what would be the best approach to deal with that? And certainly the low cost is something I'd like to see fleshed out. What would you really have to do and how much would it cost? To not only deal with the reliability with the current configuration, but also better serve Northern Virginia and the trips within Northern Virginia. That's probably a combination of local bus services, Metro bus, you know, BRT, 3 or 4 BRT or 4 or 5 BRT lines. And it will require jurisdictions to permit signal preemption where they're not already permitting it. But isn't that better than spending billions of dollars? So anyway, these are the kinds of questions that occur to me in just looking at this. And I just want to ask these fundamental questions right now. And then finally on reliability, how much of reliability problems are actually caused by the loss of power in the one track and how much are other causes? For example, equipment failures.
So on the very last question, I believe when we began the study, we did partition out the causes of reliability. I don't have the percentage off the top of my head. Mark, you may remember.
Yeah,
it for the top.
around 2/3 of any incidents over 1 minute were caused by track and vehicle issues. A full 1/3 of them were, you know, fire, customer, people holding doors, police activities that will always happen.
Or enemies in that case, right? Holding the
Basically.
doors and things like that.
Right, yes, sir.
I think the message though is that the physics for a not insignificant contributor, a contributor enough that couldn't be resolved just with either better management or self-inflicted wounds. So we will see if we can point you to the place in the extant material that has that breakdown. I know it's on the website. That's important. I think there's a clarification we probably should make to this particular slide. I think you heard me mention earlier that we were running a peak service schedule prior to SafeTrack. Or we were planning a peak service schedule, but candidly not executing it. We couldn't actually run the schedule that we were trying to run because of interlining. So I think the way this is written is that this is our peaks. This is the modeled peak service plan if we did nothing. But what it does not state in the slide is this thing is a plan that we couldn't actually execute. But when we run the numbers, we have to run the numbers against some theoretical schedule. Mark, am I getting that right?
Yes.
I'm not an engineer, but I
No,
think I
no.
got that right.
Well, I'm not either, but
Good.
your answer is that this reflects the real experience that we had in 2016, when, again, we had to reduce the service on the blue. So the crowding skyrocketed on the blue line. And we had so many reliability issues on the orange and silver that we didn't meet schedule.
We weren't actually delivering 6-minute service in the orange. That's the point.
Well, then maybe this slide ought to be altered to be more realistic. And I want a realistic comparison, but honestly, looks like pretty good service without all this expenditure. So if we're trying to make the case for something more ambitious, this kind of goes the opposite direction.
As you made that comment, both Mark and I, a light bulb went off realizing that this is a slide that needs some modification to actually be more communicative. So thank you for that.
Yeah, but all the other comments, again, trying to get a better hold of changing demand. Because my own view is the employers I talk to, it's a permanent change. We're not going back to everybody being in the office 5 days a week. And this system was pretty much designed to do that. And what I hear is a lot of trips during the day all over the place, and we're not really set up and adequately serving that at this point. So I think there's a bright future for Metro, but it may not be sort of reinforcing the old design. There may be something actually much more revolutionary that would be a better expenditure and better service for Northern Virginia and other places in the region.
Mr. Snyder always asks thoughtful questions, which is great. It is nice to see you. 3 things just to keep under consideration. Mr. Franti also mentioned that we should be revisiting and sharpening our pencils. Mark will be doing that in the next phase. We've also reached out to your George Mason University Center for Regional Analysis to give us a snapshot in time right now. They are already working with us to deliver that information because we can't wait 2 years to figure it out. So that's work that we're receiving from the center right now to help us understand exactly that question. And then that, Mr. Franti will be able to lean on that a little bit, just in understanding what's going on this afternoon over the next 18 months. That'll help. So I hope that ties a couple threads together.
I'll take a risk and sort of, I think this is helpful, and there's never a good time for long-term planning. And I kind of think that Mr. Snyder's right. And yet at the end of 40 years, I could see us still needing the tunnel to get through to Roslyn, even if the way we work totally changes. But I just keep thinking that, in my view, at least over the last 3 years, or 6 years ago, if you told me we'd have dedicated capital, I would have said you're crazy. So it seems to me that's an argument for, even with how we all don't like to do long-term planning, to time the study right so that it's not happening when the reality is totally different, if that makes sense. I'm not saying we don't need challenges and opportunity, and long-term planning, we never like to do it, but I think about how quickly the dedicated funding came together. And I just feel like I worry about pushing the good thinking that comes out of the 6 slides to its logical conclusions in the next 6 months, when I I don't see how that lines up with the moment. And then we'll hope that the next 6 years are as good, as change oriented as I think the last 6 have. But thank you.
All right, so I have a few questions myself. I think your comment was rather prudent, right? It's never the right time for long-term planning, but it's always the right time because things don't stop. We just have to, continue to pivot as things kind of move along. Along the process that you guys were going, when you had those 275 concepts, what kind of helped you to whittle it down? Was it landscape, I just can't build something there? Was it cost? Was it, well, nobody's gonna write it if we put it there? Can you just give me an idea around that?
Sure. So from the 275, and you could, well, it's the slide's not up right now, but you can see in front of you, that's a huge map.
Can we pull that slide up just for the
Yeah,
visual?
sure. Slide 11 shows public and stakeholder input. You can see this map that we put together that kind of consolidated all 275 of those ideas that we could actually draw. Some of them were text-based, just general system recommendations. You can see that even though any of them might actually be a great transit project in and of itself, you can see how wide the geographic extent was. So our first cut was, does this actually serve the origin and destination points along the Blue Ridge and Silver corridor, right? And I have to be honest, when you ask even just that simple question, it eliminated most of them. Maybe that shows how excited people are about transit and Metrorail and how much they want in their neighborhoods and where they're going. We also, though, when we had the 275, we started narrowing it down based off geography, origin and destination points, and then some of them were also very parallel to each other. So we took like 3 or 4 or 5 ideas were very similar, so we just kind of like combined them into one. And at the end of the day, we had those 16 project concepts that I mentioned. That was a much more rigorous analysis that took us down to the 6 that we looked at today. So that included the stakeholder input with like NVTC staff and their colleagues in other jurisdictions. We also we did a model run to look at the screen line at the Roslyn Tunnel to find out if it would actually reduce the crowding through the tunnel. And we also looked at if it would serve areas of density that were supportive of rail service. You have to forgive me. I think I'm forgetting like the last factor, but it was mostly like, would it solve the crowding issues? Does it serve the origin and destination points, and would it increase access in equity areas? So that was a staged approach. It factored in public and stakeholder engagement as well from the surveys. They had to, rate their responses to what they would support. And at the end of the day, we had 6 alternatives emerge that hit all of those questions.
When you say areas of density, is it just the current areas of density or some of the ones that are planned as well?
We factored in both the current and future based on the cooperative forecast.
When you line these things up and you're seeking line yourself up to seek federal funding, the first question they're going to ask you is why? Right, so we have a problem. Okay, does this project address the purpose and need of resolving the problem? And so that does whittle things out. I just want to give tip my hat to your staff at NVTC as well as our jurisdictional partners. Oftentimes these planning studies, they start and there's an idea on the table and kind of run with it. But in this case, your staff and your constituents in the jurisdictions, they threw everything at us. We ran with everything. Any idea that came our way, we ran with it to see, does this solve the problem? Because that's our commitment to public input and a rigorous process.
And I think it's the second to last slide. But basically, when I was doing the comparison of some of the different options, and we had the weekday trip estimations. So is that job commuters, tourism, people using it for day-to-day business, or the doctor's office? Was it kind of incorporating everything?
That's all trips.
All trips, okay.
Weekday though, doesn't include weekdays.
Gotcha. When you guys said crisis levels in terms of overcapacity and everything, which we've partially been already seeing for the last decade, right, with some of the cars being over capacity, or when exactly will we see this crisis level kind of emerging if we don't do anything?
That's a difficult question to answer, but because we looked at the ridership in 2020, 2030, and 2040. In 2030, if I recall correctly, let me step back for a second. Remember that we already were above our service standards today or right before the pandemic, right? So that was like PPCs on average of around 105. By 2030, we were getting up to like 110 to 115. And by 2040, it was over 120. And 120 is like our absolute maximum. So I can't pinpoint an exact year, but based off of those numbers, that means a project needs to be in place definitely by 2040 and ideally somewhere between 2030 and 2040, because I should say like 110 PPC is not acceptable, right? It doesn't hit that 120 maximum threshold, but it's still violating our service standards by a considerable margin.
And I guess I just bring that up because I was kind of feeling concerned with what the timeline looks like already. And hence, the need to do this because personally, I like to see a plan, in late 2020, early 2030. But I understand the constraints of everything that's going on. Because, if the Omada board is going to start making decisions to start going in a certain direction next year, I mean, this has huge impacts, right? This is like going back to the 70s when it first got made and the decision was made not to make multiple tracks and just have one track in each direction. So I think this is putting us at a critical standpoint again in terms of what we're going to do for the future of the system. So can you guys tell me with this timeline, how much flexibility is in this timeline? So if in the next 3 years, we see like a huge spike in ridership or we see a huge dropout in ridership, I mean, what kind of flexibility do we have in this timeline?
I believe, Chairman, the appropriate answer to the question is the timeline is a long timeline, but the study that we're shepherding right now does not take us to a commitment to actually do anything. The study we're doing right now is simply to arrive at a agreed upon set of tactics, both short-term and long-term, that then we can choose to do. And why is that sort of a distinction with a difference? Because we've been swimming around with potential ideas for the better part of 12 years. We could do this, we could do that. Well, we could do this, we could do that is not good enough to go and be competitive for federal funding for anything. And the first question they're going to ask is why. The second question they ask is what. And if we can't point to a what, then we're not in the running. The long answer to say the timeline for us is getting to the point where we have that agreed upon set of solutions, short-term, long-term, operational, tactical, physical. And then if, as Mark mentioned, we are, and Mr. Ferranti pointed out, if we're not in a position where we're looking at these numbers or not projecting them anymore, there's an option to offer it. So you know what? We spent good energy figuring this out. We're not seeing the problems that we saw in the 2020s and the 2010s anymore. Let's not obligate the region to do something that may have been last decade's problem. But we wake up in 2024 and we say, you know what, all those problems are back, we're ready. I'd always rather be ready.
Now, thank you for that differentiation. Because I also kind of think to Mr. Snyder's comments in terms of configuration, and if in a couple of years we're seeing, well, actually, we don't even need to look at the blue and orange line. We need to be looking at a separate line for a different issue, right? So hence kind of my thought process with some of this flexibility and being able to pivot when need be. So that's helpful. Thank you. Any other questions, comments for our guests?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So just want to say thank you to you guys one more time for being here and giving this presentation and taking our questions. I know it's a lot that you guys are having to handle.
It's our pleasure.
It's our pleasure. It's our job. Thanks so much to Kate and her wonderful staff for supporting us through all of this. And thanks to the NVTC for all the support for Metro you've given over the years. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for being out tonight. So our next agenda item is going to be the 2021 annual report on the performance and condition of Omada. All right. As required by state code, NVTC is responsible for the annual submission to the Governor and General Assembly of a report on the performance and conditions of Omada. This will be the fourth annual report produced by NVTC, and this update from staff is a key time to check in with the committee, provide any guidance before they finalize the report for submission later this fall.
And with my eye on the clock, I will give a streamlined presentation. This is something we talked about with the committee a great deal. As you've seen this slide before, the annual report has an introduction and 6 chapters. The most important to the committee is strategies, which we talked about at the last meeting. Those are strategies to reduce the growth in costs and improve operational efficiency of Omada. The second chapter is the use of the dedicated capital funds, and that is where we report on data we received from Metro, as well as sort of capital highlights, major accomplishments that are noted from Metro. And then the data chapters 3 through 6 cover a variety of safety, reliability, and financial performance, as well as ridership data. And that data is from WMATA. In some cases, it's reported to the National Transit Database, where that data is audited, and we report it in this annual report. In other cases, it's been produced by WMATA and included in annual Metro performance reports, and then we essentially package it in this annual report. Next slide. As I mentioned, the chapter we seek the most guidance is the strategies. We've talked about this a lot, so let's go to the next slide. Since our last meeting, we did do some changes based on committee discussion. Those 2 changes were consolidating the draft zero emission bus recommendation to fit within other recommendations in the report, and we simply renamed improved weekend service to better reflect the content, which is still the same. There is a draft of the strategies chapter in your meeting materials, and if you need to revisit the strategies themselves, they're in the appendix at the back of these slides. Next slide, please. For the uses of the dedicated capital fund, that's the $154 million from Virginia. This is how the report shook out for FY21 actual capital expenditures. We have this listed by CIP program. The highest areas of spending were on business support investments and passenger facilities investments. And then if you go to the next slide, we have an overview of major accomplishments in WMATA's FY21 capital program, which was the highest spend at $1.8 billion that WMATA has had on record. And the next slide, these are some of the major accomplishments by various CIP categories, and we'll highlight them. Next slide, Tenley, in the draft annual report, which we commissioned to take action on in December. The next one. This is a highlight of some of the reliability data from Metro's annual performance report. This slide shows on-time performance by mode. In this case, the light green is Metrorail, the dark green is Metro Bus. Metrorail showed steady improvement on-time performance through each 4 years here. For Metro Bus, the story is a little more complicated, mostly due to changes in the methodology of how this was calculated, as well as some data errors, and then the pandemic causing compressed bus schedules. So it's just a very challenging time from the data standpoint here. But as you can see in fiscal 21, that is a full fiscal year of performance data with 75% on time. Next slide, please. In terms of reliability for Metrorail and mean distance between delays, we had a record high, which is good. In this case, mean distance between delays for fiscal 21. Next slide, please. Metrobus has a similar story. And in this case, again, this is also a record high since it was calculated in 2003. And some of this was due to the pandemic from running less service. Metro was able to keep its most reliable buses on the road and continue to hold their bus fleets, but all sub-fleets showed improvements. And so at this point, stop on the next slide, the discussion slide, turn back to the chair for any discussion.
All right, discussion from the commissioners. Mr. Snyder.
Sure, thanks. I think we have to clearly discuss the events of the past week. I think if we don't, we lose credibility on the report. And I think it would be to support the board's effort to bring in additional staff. But I think to also focus on enterprise risk management within the organization. And an honest review of what works and what doesn't work and fixing it once and for all. It's not just these isolated events that keep happening. So the issue is why. And I think the board is addressing that, but it's not entirely clear. So I would urge, Mr. Chair, that there be some sort of a discussion of that. I don't need to do wordsmithing tonight, but
Sure.
and I think we have to insist that it not be repeated, simply.
So staff, can I turn to you guys? Where would be a good place to potentially bring that up?
So there's a couple of options. I think we'll obviously have more information in the coming months as we finalize this report. There is the ability to provide context in the introduction, the cover letter, and I think we can also take this back and look at any options for the strategies chapter as well.
And the other thing, so yeah, in the strategy, the introduction, I think the other thing that will be helpful, we almost did the same thing, I believe, last year with COVID, was in the actual data tables, is reminding of the snapshot in time and the definitions. Obviously, we get this data from WMATA. It's data that is as of the end of June.
So it varies, which is
Well, that's
fun
okay.
part.
Yeah. But, and I'm not even to get caught. What I'm saying is that giving a context in time
It is,
Right?
yes.
and a context. So I think there's a number of different places, whether they be call out boxes or actually weaving things. But we definitely will take those recommendations. I know both Andrew and I have written down your comments. And we're going to find where we can put it in. We know it's very important to put it in there. So.
Yeah, in terms of the vintage, I think the reliability data is all until June 30 of this year. Safety data will all be calendar 20. But I think we can obviously provide the appropriate context.
Thank you.
Mr. Snyder, is that sound about appropriate for you?
Sure, that's fine. The other issue is, I think we're addressing it, the greenhouse gas goals and Metro. It's mentioned that it's in there. Again, I don't need to, I trust you guys. You guys can figure out how to word it, but as long as we push that along, that discussion along, is important. I think Metro is a key player, but there are costs involved in it. But how do we get moving? I mean, a lot of our local jurisdictions are putting in charging stations, and we're looking at school buses and all the rest of that. So are there some joint efforts we can all do that multiple services can take advantage? I don't know, but anyway, something that nudges that forward in the report.
Slide 9, the first bullet is on 7,000, so we got to change that, I think. And I know it's real time happening, so I would agree with Mr. Snyder that I don't know the exact publication date. Our audience is the legislature, and so there's a lot of variables happening right now. But I would say I'd agree that if they're asking for external resources, I think that my instinct right at this moment would be to include that as a way of being real about what's happening now, if it's possible. I agree with the sort of direction of your comments, Mr. Snyder, about we need to be accountable, fix. I also think that the system is large, and so it's, if I remember the report, they're not a plethora of sentences where you can do this balancing. And I don't know that I personally feel like lengthy is helpful, but you guys will, I agree with Mr. Snyder, you guys will balance it. I just would fix it once and for all. That's not my lived experience in almost anything in life. And so I want to be accountable, push the accountability, but not go so far as to say too much, if that makes sense. But I agree, you guys have the balance. It's just it'll be tricky because your data is not in the time of the lens through which people are gonna be seeing it.
We do have a little benefit of time.
Yeah.
We're meeting with this committee. A draft is being shared and discussed at the November commission meeting. The final is coming to the December.
Mhm.
Not that I want to keep changing, but that we do actually have the benefit of more knowledge as we get into November.
Yeah.
Just keep normally about a week in on all of this stuff. So we will be, this will be a bit of a living document.
And
as we
Andrew can
learn
rewrite
stuff.
the whole thing in 24 hours.
By himself too. No.
But the data is the data. We will not be changing the data. We will provide context.
I concur with my colleagues' comments. I do think that 30, 60 days from now, we'll have a different lens. We all sometimes we suffer from the tyranny of the moment. I do think clearly this is an annual report through June 30. We shouldn't I agree with Matt, we shouldn't belabor the obvious, but we need to recognize it so we're not appearing to be tone deaf. And in the most general of terms, but without sugarcoating it either, just one or two paragraphs to say, we acknowledge the events of this and the need to take a hard look at the safety culture of the organization. And there was a comment earlier this evening about Metro's leadership, and that's part of it. But it really is the issue is a safety culture ethic throughout the organization, from top to the bottom. And we're gonna fix these rail cars, but it goes way beyond that. The question is, why did these things happen? Why did it take a derailment to identify these problems? And it's not just rail cars, it's our buses, it's our as-built elevated structures and other things like that we need to create a new approach to safety culture in this. This is going to take a long time to do. But like I said, don't belabor the point, put it right up there up front and in the most general of terms. And then but we'll know more in 30 days and then 45 days and 60 days. Who signs this cover front of the report?
Chair Crystal.
Yeah.
Chair Crystal does.
Yeah.
That's
So I do, I think, in fact, as we were sort of discussing on the sidelines, as we're hearing this stuff, where would this be? We have a couple different places. We typically have a cover letter, an introduction. A couple different places can go in there, as well as adding it into the relevant recommendations. And then, of course, in the data, providing content, so reminder what that data is. So I think there's a number of different approaches to make it very up in front, especially the cover letter. I think that's some really good opportunities for that.
Change, yeah.
Yeah.
And as
Just a
we get-
normal transmittal letter, it may say more.
As we get closer to the formal transmittal of this to the General Assembly, I think some key phone calls clearly to the committee chairs and the Secretary of Transportation and others, just, hey, this report is coming. And we'll talk through before they receive it so that
Okay.
they get it.
Yep. Thank you.
Well, you already kind of alluded to the key dates and next steps, but
Yep.
did you want to cover that anymore?
Sure, we can go to the next slide for me. So we'll do a quick information item at the November commission meeting with, I think, a condensed version of the slides that we're seeing here. We'll have a draft strategies chapter, just like in your materials with any relevant updates. And then again, this is time to work on it as it will be acted upon at the December commission meeting for submission by December 15th to the Governor and General Assembly.
Sounds good. Rather we have a path forward with this one. Any other last discussion points on this? All right. Moving on to, I believe, our last item is the WMATA fair policy discussion. And I know that we've talked about this a great deal
I think, Mr. Chairman, I can simply do a quick update.
I was gonna say,
That's
yeah,
appropriate.
if you want to just give a quick update.
If you go to the next slide, Tenley, this is something that we've talked about a lot. Our board members have sort of asked us to get feedback from staff, the committee, commissioners on WMATA's conversations about fair policy and structure. You can go to the next slide. Since the committee's discussion last month, Metro staff did introduce a number of fair concept ideas to the WMATA Finance Committee, which are shown on the slide, and we're in your October commission meeting materials. And all of these concepts all have various trade-offs between ridership and revenue. If you go to the next slide, Tenley. Just a reminder that right now there is a significant amount of federal relief in the FY22 operating budget. And of course, when that is exhausted, the extent to which ridership recovers will determine how much that aid is offset by fair revenue. On the next slide, I've compiled a list of essentially, or a summary rather, of our feedback to date through various discussions on the Virginia side. And so this is that summary. I think the most salient points here are striking the right balance on fares between revenue and ridership and making sure we capture employee transit benefits. There's obviously a variety of other things here we can speak to. If you go to the next slide, Tenley, I think there's a couple of major policy questions that do remain as we move into the FY23 budget cycle, which obviously will start soon. And those are mostly, I think, around parking rates. And then there are some core questions here about fare structure that were not addressed in the summary of Virginia comments because they're obviously quite significant. But at this point, I think we'll know a lot more as we enter that budget cycle, and I'll mostly wanted to keep the committee up to date as to how things were moving since there was new information from the last meeting. And I'll pause and turn it back to the chair.
Sure. Can you turn back to this one, the fair revenue? You talk about a ticking time bomb. This one is ticking very loudly because of that when the federal relief drops out, it's going to leave an incredible hole. And the idea of sort of ramping up the region for another, major influx of money, I don't know how well that's going to go over. So there are a couple things. Easy to ask the question, obviously very difficult to answer, but and the subject of free or reduced fares is inherent here. It seems to me I'd like to see I could use this, a two-track approach on this. The one track being, how do we focus on what it is we want in terms of supporting low-income and essential workers? What are the numbers? What's our goal? Let's try to be more laser about what we're trying to do in that area. And then the other track is, what are we going to do to attract riders back? So in essence, to some extent, their fares are going to support the system, which in turn generates the revenue to support the lower fares or free fares. It's very attractive to give stuff away. It's a lot less attractive to pay for it. I'd like to see us pursue both at the same time in a very parallel way. But I'd like more precision on who do we really want to provide the reduced or no fares to? And then how do we have other riders who see value that to some extent they're contributing to fill back into that space that's now federal subsidy? A little bit different approach than taking it in different parts. It's like, moving them in parallel. Just thought.
I appreciate those themes, and I think they fit very well within the summary that we presented. I know one thing that I do want to mention that has come up in especially our staffing calls with board members is there is a strong preference to, if there are low-income discounts, to have it be jurisdictionally sponsored and funded. So sort of on an individual jurisdictional basis. basis. Obviously, there can be some coordination on that, but that is at least the preference that we have voiced in the Virginia side of the discussion. This is obviously a regional discussion. And I didn't want to sort of make that linkage back, but absolutely.
One quick question. We've had this discussion, looking at these slides more than once. Has there been any change during the pandemic on the issue of fare evasion? I mean, have we seen an increase or a decrease, or has it stayed about the same?
I think from the memos that I've seen, I believe the aggregate amount is less, but that's because there are fewer riders, and the percentage share, at least on Metro Bus, has increased of evasion.
It's decreased?
Increase.
Increase, okay. All right.
Mostly in the district.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, the current policy of the district, which WMATA does not set for fare evasion,
Correct.
is that it is decriminalized and there is currently no civil enforcement mechanism. So
Right.
there are no, it's essentially a sort of a no man's land, if that makes sense. It's a gray area.
Yeah, we've had that discussion as well. And the variation between the three jurisdictions, when you look at it in terms of a centralized budget for Metro, you know, it's a question that's still out there. I just wanted to ask it one more time, but I don't know if we can do anything about it, but from the Virginia's perspective, I do believe it's something that still needs to be acknowledged. I don't want to be too judgmental or sanguine about it. It's just a footnote to this discussion, but it has a budget impact. I do have a question with respect to parking rates. It says uniformly or vary by station to station, or is that because we were trying to encourage people to go to certain stations or discourage them from going to other stations, or?
So right now, parking rates are mostly uniform. They do vary because different jurisdictions have local parking surcharges. And so not everyone has that. But at least in Northern Virginia, I believe they're all the same with the exception of West Falls Church, which was an intentional lowering to $3 a couple of years ago. Because with the change from the Silver Line coming online, basically the garage had a great deal of excess capacity. And so the idea was there was actually a pilot period to lower it. And the results of that pilot informed the board's decision to make it permanent at $3. And so the discussion that the finance committee had was, or at least the Metro staff broached was, right now, obviously, parking is underutilized. And so there could be some opportunities to sort of optimize, if that's the right word, the price to still get revenue, but also get ridership as well, as that ridership gets fare revenue. And so there was a question for the board of, well, do you want to do that uniformly? Because there's certainly a level of fairness to have the same rate at stations, or are there opportunities to have the price perhaps to a limited degree match utilization or demand? And that's kind of hard to describe because I don't believe Metro has the opportunity to have something like instantly demand-based parking rates, because there's lots of requirements about analysis and advertising and things like that. But could it be like the West Falls Church example where there's a lower rate because it's less utilized? I think that's sort of that was what was at least very preliminarily discussed and that I heard at the finance committee last month. Did that answer?
Yeah, it answers, and all the parking facilities are centrally financed by Metro.
Most.
Because where I'm going with this is some parking facilities are older than others. some had different bonding arrangements, perhaps.
Mhm.
So the projected revenues in the beginning to pay, for lack of a better term, pay off the notes on those bonds could dictate whether or not you raise or lower, or maybe it constrains our ability to adjust those fees.
So you absolutely. So the local surcharge, which in this case is, I believe, mostly a Fairfax County policy decision in Northern Virginia. Fairfax County manages that fund to pay off and sort of manage those bonds. I know it's a very important thing for them for the Silver Line Phase 2 stations. All of the Silver Line stations, so all of the parking facilities in Northern Virginia, except for the Silver Line stations, are WMATA owned and operated. The Silver Line stations are Fairfax and Loudoun are owning those. And I believe WMATA does or will operate them. But in those cases, Fairfax and Loudoun would set the parking policy rates for those Silver Line stations, and WMATA board would set the rates at the other stations.
But the parking rates could have either a direct or partial impact on ridership.
Absolutely.
So you could have jurisdictions and Metro's organization sort of, I don't want to say working at cross purposes, but there's a little bit of tension there, fiscal tension.
Yes, absolutely. And I know it's something that Mr. Letourneau has spoken to, especially with Northern Virginia staff, is just ensuring that because of the surcharge is so important, ensuring that there's ample coordination between WMATA, jurisdictional staff, and elected leaders on just making sure that there's coordination on those policy decisions.
And my other question is, and this doesn't have anything to do with fair necessarily, although it does have something to do with the attractiveness of the garage, which has an indirect impact on revenue. Do any of these garages currently have electric charging stations?
I don't know.
Would the presence of or the installation of those make the garages more attractive, less attractive, or neutral? Just asking the question.
No, I mean, yeah, we'll follow up on that. I mean, I know Dominion Power looks at, that a little bit, so that's something that we can explore.
Right.
Certainly.
That's it.
Sounds good.
Mayor Meyer, that's actually an interesting potential idea that metro parking stations could be used not only to charge buses, but they could actually be like filling stations for the general public. That's actually kind of I like where we're starting to go on that potentially. Use the metro real estate to make some additional money. This would be the place where you could go to charge your vehicle, right?
Right, and it would also make the facility attractive to someone with an electric vehicle.
Right.
They may decide to start using Metro more. I don't know.
Yeah. Right. And you could use the same charging for the Metro buses as well. So kind of interesting. Yeah.
All right. I think there's definitely a few more things to come, like you said, once we get into some of the other processes. But you guys got your notes and everything?
Yep. And that's actually a good transition to the this slide, which is that the next meeting is December 16th, but the plan there is that will be our first, depending on timing, because we never know exactly how budget timing works, discussion about the FY23 budget. So once we know more about what's proposed, various other things, we can have a much more focused, fair conversation with through the budget process.
Before we adjourn, just any other items that any commissioners want to bring up or note?
Fine, thank you.
All right. So yes, as Mr. Kvetter said, our next meeting is potentially for December 16th. Hopefully that day sticks. And we have our full body commission is going to be November 4th, I believe. All right, so with that, I'd like to thank everyone and we are adjourned for tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.